So yeah, it's me again, I'm afraid. Sorry. But I promise you that after the next 25 minutes or so, I'm done. So you don't have to hear me again. You'll have seen that a lot of the chapters and many of the chapters you haven't seen are filled with intellectual fireworks, and mine is actually a pretty turgid attempt to just understand one series. I wanted to try and do a really solid analysis of how the forms develop in a particular series to see how that would inform, tell us about not just Jeffrey's working methods, but the way he thinks as well as an artist. So that's why it's quite a step-by-step process. I just thought that was quite an interesting way of going about it. Anyway, my paper begins with a slightly more interesting thing. I thought I'd start with what's one of the most famous stories in the history of art, which is a story that was told by Pliny thousands of years ago about the origins of painting, the origins of sculpture, the origins of pictorial representation itself. And it's a great little story. I can see if this works. There you are. It's a great little story regarding a young Corinthian girl called Cora. Cora was in love with this man, and he was due to go away. In some versions of the story, he's due to go away to battle. And she was so desperate to have something by which to remember him that she sat him up against a wall, illuminated his face with a lamp, and then cast a silhouette against the wall. And with a piece of charcoal, although in this painting she's holding a brush, but it was probably originally a piece of charcoal, drew an exact outline around her silhouette. Now, this is a story that has really interested art historians for many reasons. It's seen as the origins of portraiture, it's seen as the origins of photography, it's seen as something that creates this idea of images being substitutes for absent bodies is something that is very interesting to art historians as well. But what I find fascinating about it is the fact that this story and many stories speak of the fundamental pictorial act, the first pictorial act being the act of drawing a line. That's the first thing that so many of these accounts discuss. Now, of course, Pliny's story was nonsense. I mean, it may have started that way. There's no evidence that it started that way at all. But it is, I think, interesting that if you do go back to the earliest art, if you do go back to Chauvet, for instance, this was 30,000 years before even Pliny was writing, you find that Chauvet, the cave paintings, or perhaps we should be calling them cave drawings, were dominated by lines. And the Paleolithic artists, if we can call them artists, it's difficult to know what we should call them, but the art makers, the image makers of the Paleolithic were masters of the drawn line. There are lovely images there where a single uninterrupted line has drawn the whole contour of an animal. And that line doesn't simply represent the contours and the shapes of the animal, but also reflects and responds to the contours of the stone on which it's drawn. They were incredible draftsmen. That's without doubt. But I think that throughout history, certainly in the Western tradition, the line has had this primacy that other forms haven't. And even now, if you see a child making an image, what's the first thing they do is they draw the outline and then they fill it in with colour. But the outline nearly always comes first. And throughout the Western tradition, there's been often a conflict between line and colour. We've talked about this actually in previous forums. And nearly always in the West, line has won that battle or seen to win that battle. In the 19th and 20th century, in the modern period, the line took on even a greater value because it wasn't simply seen as something with great representational value. The line was also something that was a kind of precious trace. It was an indexical trace of the artist's body, the artist's movement. This is a drawing I absolutely love. This is, there you are. This is Pablo Picasso in the late 1940s, where he did a whole set of drawings with light, long exposure photograph, a flash lamp, and would create these beautiful drawings. And that, again, is a perfect example of the line being the trace, a residue of the movement of the artist. And that was one of the reasons why the line was so valued. And, of course, this idea found particular emphasis and in the mid-20th century with the emergence of abstract expressionism, because it was then that the mark, the gesture, was seen as this extremely important germination, if you like, of creativity and also of the human spirit itself. It was in 1952 that the famous critic Harold Rosenberg spoke of abstract expressionist painters as action painters. Now, the thing is, when you look at abstract expressionist paintings, most of them aren't very linear. Most of them are actually more about colour and touch. But the most linear of them was probably this man, Franz Klein. Now, Franz Klein's paintings do look a little bit like drawings, and actually, they started out as drawings. The origins of Franz Klein's famous monochromatic style is with a little doodle. He had a little doodle in ink on a piece of paper, and he projected it, great size, onto a canvas and turned that into a painting. So in many ways, Franz Klein's paintings don't just look like drawings. They are drawings that are remade in paint. So you might be interested as to why this is relevant at all. Well, it's relevant because the young Jeffery Rubinoff, as a young art student, was very influenced by Franz Klein's paintings. And, indeed, during an evening class at Wayne State University, I think it was, in Detroit, Jeffery made a series of gestureless canvases. He started out as an action painter, made a series of gestureless canvases, black strokes on white, that were uncannily similar to the work of Franz Klein. Now, I haven't actually ever been able to find an image of these. I don't know if images exist of these early paintings, but they certainly had some merit because it was these paintings that secured Jeffery's position at graduate school at Oklahoma University in 1967. Yet, as we know, and as we know from Joan, Jeffery didn't remain an action painter for long. It was during his graduate program, during his MFA, that he switched allegiances from paint to steel, from Franz Klein to David Smith. Now, if we look at those early works, I'm not going to revisit them for long because, of course, Joan has discussed them so well. But and this is something she raised. Those early works, they are great pieces of work, Series 1 and Series 2. But they're very sculptural, and they very much allude to the material as a three-dimensional thing. So, Joan has said, and Jeffery has told me as well, that Series 1, the steel acts like stone. It is like these cubes of stone that have been hewn and piled up. And Series 2 is very much steel behaving as steel. There are tubes and pistons and cogs that are very much steel-like. But after completing Series 2 at the beginning of 1983, Jeffery, I think, wanted to revisit his earlier career as an action painter and to try and express some of those instincts and interests in painting, in line, in drawing, through his sculpture. And what I want to do in the next 15 minutes is just walk us through that series, which I think is a really pivotal series in his development as an artist, just one by one, just to show you how I think he brought this instinct of the action painter and the line drawer to sculpture and into 3 dimensions. One of the most obvious ways he did this was by changing material. So Series 1 and Series 2 was stainless steel. In Series 3, he turned to corten steel. And corten is typically manufactured in these large, flat plates, quite thin. And when it was originally made, it was very, very dark, almost black. And so from the side, it did actually look like you were dealing with thin black lines. So when you assembled a sculpture out of this corten steel, it was like you were making a drawing in space. And I just want to show you this as a little comparison I've made. This is on the left, a sculpture, Series 4, it's the Series 3, it's the 4th sculpture in Series 3 by Jeffery Rubinoff. This is photographed by the artist in the 1980s, shortly, I think, after you installed it in its position, but before the steel was sandblasted. And so you can really see that it's got the corten has a very dark, almost black quality to it. It's an interesting sculpture because it's, I believe, the only sculpture in Series 3 that is no longer in the park. I think it's in London, Ontario, isn't it? But if you compare that, or if you look at it, if you like, through squinted eyes, it looks rather similar to a Franz Klein painting from the 1950s. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that Jeffery was trying to do a Franz Klein painting in sculpture, but I am suggesting that there is an affinity there. Both artists seem to be exploring the visual possibilities of graphic lines, dark graphic marks against either space or white canvas, and what those possibilities might be. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin at the first sculpture of Series 3. I think this is just a brilliant work of sculpture. The more I look at it, the more brilliant I think it is, because it's really deceptively simple. It is just, I think Series 3 is in many ways a back to basics. We've seen this unbelievable complexity, scale, elusiveness that we see in Series 1 and Series 2, and here it's an attempt to bring everything back just to purely abstract lines. And this sculpture consists only of 4 lines, 4 plates of Corten steel. And one of the dominant interests for Jeffery in this series was an attempt to take steel, take this heavy, dense metal, and try and defy gravity with it, try and bring it up off the ground. And when I look at this sculpture, it's almost like looking at an animal or something. It reminds me of some of Lynn Chadwick's sculptures. This idea of an animal trying sort of off its hind legs to lift itself up into the ground. It really feels like something is just rising off the ground here. And what I find so impressive about this piece is Jeffery built that sense of movement simply by the incremental verticalization of the 4 lines in this piece. So you'll see the base of it is a base plate on the left that is roughly 10 degrees off horizontal. Then there's another sheet on top of it which is about 20 degrees off horizontal, which is doubling that angle. And then there's this tweezer form, a tweezer form that runs all the way through the series that is about 50 degrees off horizontal. So you've got an increasing verticalization that creates that sense of lift. I think it's an amazingly efficient and elegant piece of sculpture that deals with really the fundamentals of representation. How do you make plane and volume and mass from line? How do you take something that is leaden and weighty and bring it to life? I think that's what this sculpture does so successfully. Sculpture 2 in the series was more complex. The number of plates has been increased here from 4 to 7, and also their widths have been varied. So some of the plates are 16 inches wide, others are 24 inches wide. In some respects, the bottom half of this sculpture is similar to the predecessor. Once again, you've got that sort of 10-degree base plate that's also straddled by a tweezer-like form on the left that rises at a steeper angle towards the sky. But there are 2 new innovations. First, there's the near-vertical plate on the right, which is new. And secondly, you've got that sloping roof-like form. And you see that form in Series 2 in particular, and Series 1, that sense of something on the top, which creates a cyclical quality to the sculpture. So in many ways, I see this sculpture as a continuation of that sense of ascension, of lift that we get. In the first sculpture, we see the object just gradually bringing itself up off the ground, and in the second one, we have this emphatically upright, almost architectural structure. Rubinoff continued to elaborate on the series. So number 3. This is number 3, which is 8 plates, 8 lines. So within the space of 3 sculptures, we've seen his sculpture double in complexity from 4 to 8. What I find interesting here is this tweezer form. I've become obsessed with the tweezer form. Because what Rubinoff has done here is he's reversed the tweezer form. So whereas in series number 1 and 2, the fulcrum is at the top, in number 3, it's the pincers that are at the top. And that has a dramatic impact on the nature of the sculpture, because when you reverse the orientation of the pincers, you lose that post and lintel structural quality that you see in that piece, for instance, and you get these exploding forms that seem to explode in 2 different directions. But perhaps the most significant and for me the most interesting part of this sculpture, is the exploitation of negative space. Artists throughout the 20th century, Joe mentioned it, have been interested in using space itself as a medium with which to make your forms. And here you can see how Rubinoff, and if you travel round the sculpture, as always you should, you begin to see all these wonderful geometrical forms emerging in the gaps between the plates. So you can see a lovely triangle there. My favourite part, and I love this, I think it's one of the most compelling things in all of the sculpture park for me, is that square at the apex. You can just see an almost perfect square has been made where these 4 sheets of corten have opened up, and you can just see a little bit of the fir tree in the background. And I always feel when you stand in front of that and you see it hovering right at the apex of the sculpture, that square, you know, it's almost like seeing a Malevich abstract painting just hovering above you. And that, again, reminds me of that early idea, the idea of drawing in space, that he is using corten steel and the edges, those sharp, dark edges, to create shapes. Now, we've already looked at number 4. It's the one that I showed you that was much blacker before it was sandblasted. So let's move on to number 5. It's another wonderful piece, and again, I'm fascinated in those tweezers. Look what he's done here. He's got the tweezer pointing up and the tweezer pointing down. And I think this reveals to me, it reveals one of the fascinating ways that Jeffrey works as an artist. That's what's really great about seeing how following a series, piece by piece by piece, you can see the way that the brain is working and the way that he's thinking, what if I did this? It's what Joan calls the what-if proposition. He's thinking, what if I actually take tweezers and put them in both directions? I actually wrote this. I said, all of the artist's serial works are fueled by this rapacious thematic cannibalism. As with the evolution of species, each new sculptural organism is produced by the cross-fertilization and mutation of the genetic material that comes before it. There is a sense that's fascinating to see how Jeffrey's revisiting his earlier pieces and thinking, what if I took that and now combined it with that? I think this is just a lovely, lovely piece of work. I think Rubinoff by this stage was obviously, he knew long before that his pieces had to be understood in sequence. And already I hope you're beginning to see from my paper that you have to understand them in sequence. So much so that indeed I think the 6th sculpture, this one here, Rubinoff bought back from a collector so it could be seen alongside its siblings. But let's move to the 7th one. This is a perfect example of Rubinoff's mixture of precedent with novelty. Because in some respects, it's a return to what we saw in the first sculpture of the series. It's also based on a group of near horizontal plates that support something that is closer to vertical. And it too hints at this idea of a body just lifting itself gradually, painfully almost, off the ground. Yep. Once again, we have innovations. The first thing is the thicker plate. I think this is the first time you use the 1-inch corten plate rather than half-inch corten plate. So it's a much heavier, thicker piece. The other thing, and I think this is one of Jeffrey's defining innovations as a sculptor, is the creation of the T-beam. So you can see right at the top, there's that T. Now, I don't think many artists have exploited the T-beam as consistently and as imaginatively as Jeffrey has done. And I wonder where you got it. I mean, maybe we can talk about that afterwards, whether it was coming from construction, where T-beams are often used as load-bearing structures. But I think that T-beam obviously serves many wonderful functions. But one of the things, again, it brings me back to this idea of the T immediately, particularly in this photograph, emerges as a 2-dimensional shape. And it's that idea of, again, drawing lines in space that the T-beam seems to suggest. So now we move to the penultimate sculpture in the series. And this, Jeffrey has told me, is the apex of the series. You've told me, Jeffrey, that this is the piece you were trying to get to all along with this series. And I think when I look at it, it's just such a fantastic piece of work. It's a heavy work. It's a large piece. It's 7 plates of corten steel there. But what I love about this piece is look where it hardly touches the ground. It touches the ground in 3 very delicate places, so delicately that it almost seems like it's on its tiptoes. Just 3 spots. And that must be an exceptionally difficult thing to pull off. that attempt to make something look so light. And once again, we see it recycles many of the motifs from the previous sculptures. We see, for instance, the tweezer form. We see the diagonal roof structure. We see the incremental angles as used from 3-1 onwards. But here, the relationship between them, that relationship between positive and negative values, you see how the negative space has grown much larger in this piece than in predecessors. That balance is so perfect that the sculpture does really seem to jump off the ground and dance. And I remember, Jeffrey, when, and it sort of almost looks like brushstrokes or lines on a page. There's something completely weightless about this piece. It's really, I think, one of the most impressive pieces in the park, and I've gone to stand and look at it many, many times. And I remember when I went a few years ago with Jeffrey, he looked at that piece, and you were filled with pride. And you had a big smile on your face, and you said, and I quote you, "That sculpture is pure action painting." That's what Jeffrey said to me, and I really feel that I couldn't say that better. There was to be one final piece in this series. And in many ways, I'm puzzled by this piece. I think it's a really great piece, but I'm puzzled by it because we see that climax of the dancing, weightless court and steel in the sculpture before it. And this one is a much more weighty work. It's actually 2 heavy T-beams, one of which is horizontal, turned upside down, and the other one seems to almost be tumbling into the grass. So it's a much heavier, weightier, more horizontal piece than its predecessors. And I can't escape the suspicion that this piece is in some ways a fitting end to this cycle. I love the fact that Jeffrey's work is often compares it to nature and natural processes, and I love the fact that this series took exactly 9 months to make, the time that it takes for a fertilized egg to become a baby, and that over that 9-month period, it does seem to follow a life cycle. It follows a life cycle from sort of that birth that we saw in the first, the birth of life, if you like, in the first sculpture, and then tentative but optimistic growth, and then maturity characterized by invention and reinvention again, and then triumph in this piece, followed by inevitable obsolescence, that sense of just the exhaustion, having gone on this remarkable journey. But let us end where we started, with the simple drawing of a line. Because I believe this fundamental pictorial act, the line that is at the very heart of so much representation, an act that links everything from Chauvet Cave and that Corinthian girl called Cora all the way through to David Smith and Franz Klein, proved fundamental to the evolution of Series 3. Indeed, I interpret this series of sculptures as a lesson in the endlessly generative capacity of line. The ability of using line to take a weighty matter and bring it to life and throw it up into the air. Over the course of 9 variations, Rubinoff used these sharp, dark surfaces of the corten steel. Notice as well that he never creates blocky forms. There are no cubes. There are no 3-dimensional forms in that sense. All of these are about planes and lines to represent all the lines that run through space. But I also think that Rubinoff drew different lines through this sculpture. He drew the lines that run through time. There are many different time lines, if you like, that run through this series. There is the time that exists within each sculpture, that sense of rise and fall. There is the time that exists between the sculptures, that life cycle, if you like. And finally, there is the time that exists around the sculptures and acts on them. The diurnal time, the seasonal time, the geological time. And I'd like to finish just with an image that doesn't have any lines in, but only colours. This is a beautiful photograph taken by Jeffrey himself, one of the surfaces of the corten steel. This is the colour on the left. You can see that colour that the corten goes after it's been sandblasted, and it's got this wonderful quality that stretches from crimson to yellow ochre to brown. And on the right of that photograph, this photograph is in the book, by the way. On the right of that photograph, it's joined by washes of green and blue and violet and allusions to moss and lichen that Joan has talked about. And all of these colours, of course, what's wonderful about them is all of them echo the landscape that surrounds the sculptures. These are the colours of the landscape that appear on the steel itself. And I love the way that these colours are applied, almost like a pointillist artist might apply paint onto a canvas. So when I look at a piece like this, I think that's pure action painting as well. And thank you.
So we'll have a few comments and questions for James.
Yes. Are you familiar with the work of Robert Murray?
Yes.
Because it's very similar, and of course, Robert Murray was at Oklahoma. I think he led a workshop, did he, Jeff? Or
yeah, he spent a week with the graduate students.
And certainly, if you look at his work, and he's of an older generation, also began as an abstract expressionist. If you look at his work, for instance, Flight, which used to be in front of the Vancouver airport, and people didn't like it, it was moved. There's many similarities. So he might be, included as well. And just another observation, with those Chauvet drawings, I don't just see them as drawings, I see the volume. I see that the concept of volume is, to me, almost as significant. And the use of course, we don't know what the original color was because it's changed, obviously. But I see volume there as well as line. And you could almost do the same talk, I think, talking about volume and Jeffrey's work.
James, I thank you for a very thorough analysis of this series. But I would like to add that one thing that you mentioned, you repeatedly talk about that these pieces try to lift themselves off the ground. There is a struggle. I see such a struggle in a series 2, but to me, in a series 3, all the struggle is gone. They exist outside of gravity. There's the piece. This is what Jeffrey has accomplished that I haven't seen any other pieces by other artists. Is they're so self-contained. They exist outside of gravity. They happen to be in vicinity of Earth and that particular field, and they just gently touch it. But all the dynamic and which happens within them, it's not the interaction between the sculpture and the gravity.
Yeah, it's funny comparing the way that the gravity works. I feel that in Series 1 and Series 2, often the struggle of rise and fall is contained within each sculpture. So you can almost see there that there's that sense of creation and collapse. But that doesn't happen at all in Series 3. It happens, I suppose, perhaps between the sculptures, so that seems to be on its way down. But that sculpture, there is no struggle at all there. That is just one that is just dancing above the ground. So, yeah, this, I think, when I say struggle, there is a difference between that one's relationship to the ground and that one's relation to the ground. That one is something that is on the way up, and that is a sculpture that has no problem. It's up and it's running, so to speak.
James, isn't that almost cyclical in the way that this works? I don't want to be irreverent, but when you showed us, the tweezer theme and then the pincer movement and then the roof element, I was thinking of a sort of Japanese-style game where we could say tweezer nips pincer, but pincer supports roof, but roof shelters tweezer, and we go round and round in a way.
Well, it's funny. It's very difficult to have to find the vocabulary to describe abstract sculpture, and these sculptures are so resolutely abstract that it's very difficult to know actually how to describe them unless you resort to these kinds of figures. I'm sure Jeffrey wouldn't like the idea of me talking about the tweezers and pincers, but I do not have the vocabulary to describe these forms in any other way. And if anyone has another word for pincer or tweezer, I'd be happy to change it in the manuscript. But yeah, I don't know, what would you call them, Jeffrey? Or do you not think of them as anything really? It's just forms. Yeah.
Joan and then Ellie.
I made a couple of my own notes, and one of the things that just kept coming back to actually was Matisse and Matisse's sculpture. And I just wanted to know, Jeffrey, did you spend time looking ever at Matisse's sculpture?
Yeah.
Like the Serpentine?
I have a thing about painters and sculpture. You choose, and it always disturbs me when painters don't choose. And so I have that throughout a period of time. So I've never taken Matisse's sculpture seriously. I've taken his painting seriously, but not. And the same goes with Degas. I can't stand his sculpture. So it's like, it seemed to me that there was a choice that I had to make in my life, and I made the choice. It became a clear choice to me that you're choosing between one or the other. But otherwise, there's an obvious conflict between that which sits on one picture plane and that which sits on an infinite number of picture planes. And the two the two parts are so entirely different from an aesthetic point of view that if you don't make the choice, then I find it very disturbing. So I made my choice, and I don't paint anymore. So I would have hoped that he stopped making sculpture, but after he did his first one, I would have hoped that was his last.
The Serpentine is actually one of the first examples in the history of sculpture, the most potent, in which the development of negative space as a palpable thing is most fully developed.
Well, we've talked very little about negative space, and to me, it's the key to that part which makes sculpture not an object anymore. It's the interplay, the tension between the positive and the negative space that happens there that turns it into something metaphysical, where it turns it away from the object and turns it into the concept that it's the space that the art occupies. So, yeah, the thing about Matisse, though, is he had to make a choice. I think he's an absolute spectacular painter. And I've never seen a bad Matisse painting, but I do not like Matisse's sculpture. I will admit that.
Yeah, I just had a question about the materials, because walking through the park yesterday, the way they change and weather over time is so different. And I was wondering if going to the Core 10 from the stainless was at all thinking about the weathering process as well, just because they change in different ways. And I'm seeing the last one that you showed. With all the color
Absolutely. One, of course, reflects light. The other absorbs light. And so they're juxtaposed throughout the sculpture park, so that the actual choosing of and selection, if you notice, as you move, you'll find the stainless steel pieces showing through, but they never attempt to dominate the Core 10 pieces. We took one of the new series a few years ago and wanted to put it into that upper field over there, and it made every piece in that field look silly. So that's why those big stainless steel pieces that are made now are all isolated to their own part of their own environment. No, it doesn't. The big ones don't work with the big ones, but the little ones work with the big ones. So the choice of whether reflecting light or absorbing light is part of what goes on here. And if you look at the water places that we have here, water out there, the sky versus the forest and the trees, then you have this tension between the absorption of light and the reflection of light, and that's throughout the park, but then that's the nature of the park itself. One aspect of line that you didn't talk about, which I think is really important, and when I take the tours through, I do it. When you place a piece of sculpture outdoors here, then you change from the counterpoint that happens in a white cube gallery. So these early pieces here were done for a white cube type of gallery in Toronto when they were done. Their counterpoint remains contained internally. So when you walk around the pieces, you see into them. The minute that you bring a piece out into the environment here, then something else happens. And a huge number of timelines happen here. So one of the reasons why pieces here, which can be very geometric and even mechanical looking at times, work in this environment, which most people would assume would not, is the understanding of counterpoint, visual counterpoint, being quite different than musical counterpoint. With musical counterpoint, our minds can really only deal with 4 independent voices in musical counterpoint. I think Bach experimented with 5 and Mozart with 6. But what happens when the human mind listens to more 4 voices of polyphony, you want to run from the room. And we don't know why, but I would say, I would speculate that what happens with that is genetically based. So that our hearing is far more primitive than our sight, and the efficient evolutionary time with that was that you were allowed to identify 4 enemies, and your mind did not want to go to any more than that, and the 5th one would be the one that ate you. Now, what happens with visual counterpoint is something very, very different, and I was totally aware of it. The minute that I took these white cube pieces out, I realized that the sighting of them would be absolutely critical within this environment. And what I have been strongly aware of are the timelines. And so the timelines around here, and even attempting to make sculpture in this environment, is totally intimidating. This is a very sculptural environment. So we have a mountain here, and we have the line, which is not showing right now, that I call the lifeline. So when we're talking about that line that James was talking about, as an art student, the first thing that you learn if you're a Western art student is that that line is a lifeline. And that lifeline is so immediately connected to the caves, so that what I've shown in a demonstration that I did, which most people did not see, is that same line is in Michelangelo and Leonardo, and that's the European lifeline. And what's so interesting about the European lifeline is it's so particularly European. And so there was just like hundreds of miles away from them. And so there's somehow a meme pool that translated that down through the ages because obviously they didn't know anything about the Chauvet cave or any of the caves. So when you look at the animals in Altamira, Picasso was so conscious of it. I don't know if you saw that movie of him at 90, where he would just take one line and bring it here. Now, what's so important about that lifeline is that I've carried that as a neo-European, whatever, artist forward. And it seems like that lifeline really is only European. If you look at art from other parts, ancient art from other parts of the world, it tends to be very clearly stylized, whereas what it does in the European art, what gives such enormous life to those caves, is that each line is different, as each animal is different. Now, when you place a piece in this environment, as opposed to a white cube type of environment, the counterpoint changes. And the counterpoint has to take into account the timelines around it. And what happens is that the organic timeline, the reason why these pieces seem to work here, is that the organic timeline is firstly carried by the mountain back here itself. It has its own lifeline that it carries through, and the mountains of Vancouver Island have their own lifeline. And when you bring that geometry, which is the human the human addition to this environment, instead of it being in conflict with the environment, the geometry of the pieces works with those timelines, and those timelines aren't here. So what James was talking about was what was internal to the work, which is true. But when the work is placed out here, these other organic lines are there. And we've done a lot of verming around here, and what we found was what worked was the shape of this mountain which we would use in each berm that we did. And it would either go parallel or at 90 degrees to the mountain. And that's done all around us, and no one ever sees it because it's hidden within it. But it's all part of the same configuration of how this all works. So when you place one of these geometric pieces into this environment, you have to take into account all of the timelines that are here. But if the piece is strong enough, and the way that I measured each piece as it was done, is it would come out of the studio, and there's an area outside of the studio where the newest piece is, that I think is one of the strongest points. It's the center point of this 360-degree environment. And if the piece could survive, well, it didn't matter what size it was. This, in fact, the smaller it was in surviving in that environment and could speak to that entire environment, then I knew I had accomplished what it was that I was after. And so that was the most difficult spot. So this is actually a crushing environment and a destructive environment to a sculptor, unless you understand it. And then what you have to be able to understand is that what we bring as humans to it is our own history of art. And to me, I did work on these smaller organic pieces, but you notice I didn't work on large organic pieces. The small organic pieces have their own containment within the organic environment itself. And to me, the strength of those pieces is that they actually hold up as individuals within this entire environment. So it does get really difficult, but that's one of the things that we didn't talk about that's in here.
I have two questions which are perhaps connected. The first is the choice of language, talking about it being architectural. Because in many ways it's sort of anti-architectural to me, and the choice of, I guess it's a question for both James and Jeffrey, in that you're choosing very thin corten and an incredibly extruded length of the T-beam, for example, which could never be structural, never operate architecturally. Yet obviously there's this kind of framing of negative positive space, which is, you could argue, architectural. And connected with that, and we're sort of relating back to Sergei's comment earlier in relation to David Smith, about that perception of David Smith's work being sort of frozen in time, these falling elements, whereas Jeffrey's work is more about sort of balanced element. For me, which I think speaks particularly to this series, is the sense that the hierarchy here is much more in balance with its context. I mean, obviously all sculpture is sort of shaped by its context, but here it's that equality of the sculpture and the context framing it. And because there's that sense of this thing in balance, it sort of relies on this it creates this sense of sort of real tension of it's about to fall. And it's not falling, but it's about to fall. There's a sense of the environment around it needs to be incredibly static and careful and delicate. And that makes you reappreciate the kind of brutality, the beauty, the intensity of the environment around this pure, raw nature, which Jeffrey has also shaped, in the way it's sort of withheld back from the geological power of Mount Jeffrey to the kind of, shaved grass around it, to the trees and everything that's been formed and the land that's been formed. So I think, maybe that's partly a response to Sergei, but also thinking about how it is architectural as well, in that sense of that equality of the context shaping the work itself as well. So I guess it's sort of two semi-questions, half-related, sort of put together. So I guess the first question is really, so what is the architectural?
I was listening to dialogue, but lost the question.
I just wonder on that note whether we should revisit those answers over lunch, because I think David, we're due for a paper with David, aren't we? And we're 15 minutes late already.
Yeah, would that be okay with you?
Yeah, if you can just give a quick comment on what is architectural about that. Why are you using that word specifically?
Did I use it?
No, for James. And then for Jeffrey also, does he see an architectural element there?
I don't believe these sculptures are architectural. They're sculpture. However, the T-beam that vocabulary of the T-beam came from somewhere. The only reason I only use the word architectural actually in this one, simply because it's that idea of I think in the paper I use the term post and lintel, that idea of having verticals supporting some kind of semi-horizontal. Of course, there's nothing structurally architectural or socially architectural about that. But it was my way of describing the way that these roof forms that you have over here as well have that kind of, they remind me of that kind of form.
Now I remember the question. The T-section, as far as I knew, no one had used it in sculpture. Now, when you go to a scrapyard, it's really easy to find I-beams and H-beams as a cross-section. And they're often used. Marc de Souvreau used them all the time. Well, I was evolving and looking for the next thing to add to originality, because by doing the pieces one at a time, I was trying to measure the originality of the pieces themselves. So there's a transition point with piece number 3 here, where I feel like I've crossed out of David Smith, where he was headed, into another place. So part of my obligation to myself in doing the pieces one at a time was to be able to look at each one and then say, okay, what can I add next that I've never seen before? And what I realized was the T-section, no one had ever used it in sculpture. And that it was a highly challenging, it was a totally challenging section to use. And yes, it's not used architecturally as far as I know, although occasionally T-sections are used in steel joists, right? But as far as I knew, no other sculptor had actually addressed it. And it became wholly challenging, so that a whole other series evolved out of that T-section. Yeah. Does that answer that? Yeah. But architectural, no, I never would have thought of it as architectural.